Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Var Valley, where we are primarily, but not exclusively, dedicated to the issues of ancient chronology. The issues of ancient chronology is the primary focus, but we're just not completely dedicated just to ancient chronology. But today we're still going to discuss ancient chronology. Um, I am honored again to have my guest, Emmet Sweeney, who is a chronology revisionist, somebody I've become very familiar with his work over the years, and we've established a friendship over the last few years. Today's episode, we're going to still primarily focus on, excuse me, the vindication, what we'll call it, of Gunnar Heinsohn. For any naysayers, for anybody that says, "Oh, well, this stuff is just made up, or it's a conspiracy theory, or what have you." No, this is very serious work, and it will solve the conundrums that archaeologists face in the world of history, especially with the biblical chronology. It is our focus and mission statement that the belief in the biblical chronology is the problem with Western historiography. Point blank, plain and simple. It throws the biblical archaeologists into a tailspin, and it also distorts ancient history. So we would like to start off today. Let me get my glasses on here. Uh, where ancient history is distorted because of the belief in the biblical chronology. We've outlined it on previous shows, and I think eventually I'm going to do a slide presentation, maybe in a week or so. But we want to focus today that ancient history is distorted because of the belief in the biblical chronology. So, Emmett, you want to get started and take us on our journey for the day?
Yeah, thanks very much, Sean. It's good to be back. Um, yeah, the whole of ancient history is full of conundrums, mysteries, puzzles, enigmas, and this has led to all kinds of weird and wonderful theorizing by various alternative historians. Now, there exists a kind of a cottage industry of debunkers of people like Graham Hancock um, and the claims that they make, and establishment debunkers, um, people who claim to speak for the science, as they say. Um, and there's this general uh, attempt to prove that there are no real mysteries uh, concerning the early civilizations and um, the various phenomena that we see regarding the structures that the early civilizations created. For example, Graham Hancock and various others claim that there was a lost civilization. They find everywhere, they find similar characteristics, cultural characteristics, uh, cyclopean giant masonry used, pyramids and mounds, pyramid building all over the world, mound building. Um, And the alternative historians claim that this is some kind of evidence that our understanding of ancient history as we find it in the textbooks is not complete, is erroneous in some way. And of course, that is poo-hooed by the debunkers. They say there's no mystery. Um, People had this idea of building mounds or pyramids in different parts of the world for different reasons. It was some kind of a cultural or economic or um, organizational impetus that made them do this. Um, and of course, if the chronology as it's found in the textbooks is correct, then that is a reasonable explanation. For example, it's understood that the pyramids and the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, which are the Mesopotamian or the Babylonian pyramids, it's claimed that their construction, their building began around 3000 BC, whereas the pyramids of the New World of Mexico and South America, they only began around 1000 BC. So 3000 BC in the Old World, 1000 BC in the New World. So the debunkers say, how can there be any connection? They're, they're obviously just local forces were producing this idea of building pyramids, building these high towers upon which sacrifices were offered to the gods. And this is where both Emanuel Velikovsky and Gunnar Heinsohn come in. Now, Velikovsky died in 1978, and his central idea was that early civilizations were fundamentally shaped by cosmic catastrophes. That these catastrophes occurred, disturbances basically in the solar system. They ended, or they ended around near the beginning of the first millennium BC. But these events had a profound impact upon early human beings, and they shaped the early cultures. Now, Velikovsky understood that pyramid building, for example, somehow was related to these cosmic catastrophes. Now, in most societies, including in Mesopotamia, and I'm quite certain in the Far East, and certainly in the Americas, pyramids were high altars upon which were sacrificed animals or people. Now, the word altar comes from the Latin altus, meaning a high place. So all altars, even among the Romans, obviously, because it's a Latin word, were high places upon which sacrifices were offered, blood sacrifices. Now, Velikovsky understood this had something to do with the recent cosmic catastrophes which early humanity had witnessed. But it was up to Gunnar Heinsohn and I think Herbert Illig, his colleague in Germany, had some input into this idea as well. It was up to him and Illig that to put the final sort of a brick or piece in the jigsaw puzzle. And they came to, Heinsohn came to realize that all the early civilizations in Old World and the New World, and including in the Far East, so China, India, the Middle East, the Americas, they all arose simultaneously. That there was a massive chronological error, which placed the civilizations of the Old World 2,000 years before the rise of the civilizations of the New World. And so the claim that there was some kind of a common impulse or impetus at work when people created pyramids, these high towers upon which blood sacrifices were offered, that could be dismissed. If there's a 2,000-year gap between the pyramids or pyramid building in the New World and in the Old World, then it had to be just coincidence. It can't have been a common human reaction to a shared experience. Okay, but Gunnar Heinsohn says no. This is not correct. This is not an accident. This is not a coincidence. Human beings were obviously influenced by a common experience that every person, every human being in the world, every culture experienced. Okay, so you had this element of a cosmic serpent, a dragon, which was worshipped at the pyramids. Sacrifices were offered to this dragon, which breathed fire and brimstone upon the earth, and high altars were constructed upon which to offer these sacrifices. And these high altars were, in fact, the pyramids or the mounds, which occur also in North America. And in basically every part of the world, it doesn't really matter where you go, North or South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, or even Australia. There are mounds, there are ancient mound structures, and there's evidence that a cosmic serpent, a dragon, was worshipped at these mounds, and that blood sacrifices were offered to them. Now, that makes sense if one of the things that one of the ideas that Immanuel Velikovsky um, highlighted was that the cosmic serpent was some kind of a comet. Okay, it was a comet, of course, has a long tail, so it was a serpent that flew through the sky. So hence the wings of the dragon, and it breathed fire and destruction upon the earth. Okay, so hence we have this dragon figure all over the world. In China, in the Americas, in Mexico, we have Quetzalcoatl. The dragon in ancient Egypt was called a pop or Apophis. Um, Tiamat was the dragon in Babylonia. Every culture has this dragon monster, this cosmic serpent, which was greatly feared, and which blood sacrifices were offered to in order to appease it, in order to um, divert its anger from humanity and save the earth from a you know a repeat cosmic catastrophe. And Heinsohn, as I say, realized that this was a simultaneous experience, that the civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia didn't start constructing pyramids 3,000 years before Christ. In fact, their pyramid building age, their mound building age, commenced roughly at the same time as those of the Americas, which is closer to around 1000 BC, shortly before 1000 BC. And of course, this meant a complete um, jettison, a jettisoning of the entire chronology of the civilizations of the old world. Um, how he came to that conclusion and um, how he proved it, that's another question. It's a big, big question, and it requires an awful lot of a certain degree of explanation and patience, I suppose, to listen to the explanations as well.
Mhm. Yeah, we, us being revisionists or in the revisionist lane, we understand it, and we know how he used forensic evidence to come upon his conclusions.
Yeah,
Also, the key component would be Greek historians, which nowadays are laughed at by collegians and academians, is that they got things totally wrong in the past. The belief in the biblical narrative um, places Greece and actually Rome as later cultures. We don't know what Greece was happening in Greece in 2500 or 3000 BCE. We don't know what was happening in Rome in 2500 or 3000 BCE, because the chronology of the Bible extends the Greek chronicles of human history back about another 1500 years so out of date. Just to kind of summarize what you're saying, and we see from Heinsohn's work of realigning with the stratigraphy, even the science and technology can't be ahead of its time. It can't be outdated.
yeah,
It only makes perfect sense that the like Mesoamerican cultures or in the Americas or anywhere else that people were building mounds or pyramids that were committing human sacrifices and animal sacrifices
yeah,
absolutely has to line up with the other cultures that were in the East. It can't
yes,
be you have a culture now in, say, Mesoamerica that's 1500 years after the monumental cultures, we'll say, in the East. Now they're doing the same thing.
yeah,
They're using iron late. They are building pyramids late. It has to all line up because they're behaving the same way. They're committing the
yeah,
same acts. We can get into the nuts and bolts in that another show, because that's a very interesting topic. It
yeah,
all leads us into the same confluence of information to problem solve. But that seems to be the issue. Again, I
yeah.
read a paper very recent. It was Trevor Palmer's paper on the
Hmm.
writers and rewriters of the first millennium, I think it's called. And
Yeah,
in that, Eusebius, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, his works, um, as reconstructed by Scaliger are extremely complicated and complex, and it's really just mathematics
Yeah.
and using Sothic dating essentially, which is again very, very um, complicated, which Gunnar Heinsohn just called it pseudo Sothic dating or pseudo
Yeah.
astronomical dating. Um,
Yeah.
the people at the time of Vesuvius and even in Scaliger's time, prior to 1000 AD, nobody was keeping track of time the way we do now. They had
Yeah.
reigns of kings. We know that.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
didn't have dates. That's a huge problem. I mean, the ancient people are building pyramids. They are um, establishing cultures. They have their issues, though. They definitely do. But they didn't keep dates. They
Yeah.
kept reigns of kings. So it poses a huge problem. Some would say, "Oh no, that you guys are just coming up with your own conspiracy, and or the chronology issue has never been an issue." Well, it's always been an issue. Once I read Jananthal's books, I didn't know the arguments at the time whenever the excavations were taking place. Huge arguments. Um, whereas you had a split with what they're finding and what strata layers is conflicting with the established chronology. And as we've talked, they came up with the heirloom theory
Yeah.
that would explain why you're finding um, artifacts that could be 1,000 years out of date.
Yeah.
It even becomes, and I'm just kind of monologuing for a second before I let you continue. I just read another paper, Mazar, and she has passed away. Mazar definitely said that she has a shovel in one hand and the Bible in another hand.
Yeah.
That's the problem with biblical archaeology. So, in the city of David, in Jerusalem, they find an Aeolic capital that is absolutely classical Greek in design, no question. So in her mind, she's like, "Oh wow, it's in a park. There's a parking lot there now, which is, again, it's fascinating to find that there." Right in her mind,
Yeah.
right away. These have to be proto Aeolic capitals. This iconic capital is 400 years prior to when they were in style.
Yeah.
Instead of, wait a minute, is it possible that King David should be moved farther ahead in history, and not by 100 years? David Roll tinkers with the chronology idea, but he's moving
Yeah.
it just a little bit. Same with Finkelstein. Finkelstein slides it up like this. It's that Iron Age 1 and 2A argument that carbon dating and dendrochronology does not solve. He just moves them up a little bit too, but it doesn't solve anything. Back to it. It's as if David never existed and he's a fictitious character. One more point. Roll. David Roll. You have the Armana letters
Yeah.
dated to about 1400-ish BCE.
Yeah.
Well, you have the Armana letters before there's even an Exodus. And it leaves things like who the Hapiru and how would the Hapiru be in Canaan without an Exodus, if you will. Well, it becomes quite obviously it's wrongly dated. And the conservative end, without the forensic evidence, they slip and slide and move the timeline either high or low only by a small margin, where it actually should be moved by a much larger margin to put things back into its proper context. And Heinsohn really nailed that.
Yeah.
Some another YouTuber who is a friend called it a slam dunk. Well, the AD chronology, anyway, it's a slam dunk. And he admitted that he did not know about the AD chronology until like many years ago. Not that many years ago. We'll say what, 2010-ish. About that time, I'm just going off the top of my head. Before he didn't know about the AD chronology issues prior to the BCE works that he did. From what you're saying again, from the Greek historians like Diodorus, Herodotus, from using reigns of kings, we're moving the chronology approximately where it should be. And I use the word approximately because you'll never get it quite exact, but approximately from 1950 as BP time means before present, you're only looking at about 2,500 years of continuous human history with no dark ages in any culture. You could have the cultural declines where the cultures declined, but they kept going. They never stopped. And once you look at all the forensic evidence to support that, everything starts to realign. But then, hey, some people might get a little scared or spooky, I would say, because now the late Neolithic period is only 2,500 years from 1950 going backwards, about 2,500 years, which means people are in a hunter-gatherer culture still going back. And then these events like the cosmic serpent and the mound building would take place shortly thereafter, if not around the same time as the late Neolithic period, essentially. So it realigns, and you're just pretty much cutting out the gaps that don't belong anyway. Which is why, again, the archaeologists, like we've talked, are in just a conundrum of disagreement, not being able to come upon conclusions. Consensus is a mess. So I've
Yeah.
even made the comment and statement, and this is not a jab at anyone, but for the Ev Cochran, Dordo Cardona, Dave Talbot, even Juno Cook. It seems that they were unaware of this, or some were aware. I know there was some pushback from Duardo and definitely Ev Cochran, but as a Velikovskian, we are looking to put as many tools in our toolbox as possible and problem solve interdisciplinary, by interdisciplinary means, I'll say.
Yeah.
So if we try to put the cosmic serpent into the framework of the established chronology, I think that is a fatal mistake in that line of research. It absolutely is a fatal mistake. Definitely
Yeah.
academia is not going to take it serious, for certain. But with the chronology revision, then we put the pieces of that puzzle in place. Things may, I would hate to use go a little bit smoother, but we can put it in better context. Because I
Yeah.
still don't know from the revisions, and it may be difficult, the sequence of, let's say, Talbot's work, the sequence of F. Cochran's work,
Mm-hmm.
the sequence then of Duardo's work, and even Juno Cook. And Juno Cook was really good at, he placed it pretty well within the established chronology. But if that established chronology based on biblical fundamentalism is wrong, well, then that has to be reworked. And it's not an impossible task at all, but
Yeah.
it is a task indeed. Um, just wanted to kind of get that out. I know I spit it out, but that's just the way I see it. Because, in this channel, we also want to interview the Saturnian reconstruction. It's the Mars and Venus epic.
Mm-hmm.
People that have, we call it PMP, planets and plasma. We want to talk about that,
Yeah.
but we want to keep it within the context now of the framework of Gunnar Heinsohn, which to me is the most important part of that movement, or this movement, we'll just say, not that movement, this movement. Once you have the framework with chronology correct, then we can talk about the human animal sacrifices, the pyramid building, the mound building, the wars and fighting amongst human beings that still goes on to this day and hasn't stopped. With a shorter chronology, it makes more sense as to why it hasn't stopped. With a shorter
Yeah.
chronology, it makes sense to why we have the Leningrad and the Aleppo Codex. These are vague memories by the Hebrew culture. And these
Yeah.
vague memories aren't as far back as we would think they are. So they're
Yeah.
vague, but it's very well structured. The Bible's very well put together. It makes much more sense, as to why there's any remembrance of the BCE times 1,000 years after the BCE times. If for the
Yeah.
people that don't really understand this or new to it, it makes way more sense of how. I'll make my last point and land my plane. When you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, we'll say the second to third centuries BCE, and them being copied till about the second century CE, Then you have a gap up until the Aleppo Codex, and you can't show any more Hebrew language development. But then in the Aleppo Codex in Leningrad, you have the vowel points that come up that aren't in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So things start to make a whole lot more sense. I'm going to pass the mic back. I just wanted to get that out because we want to stay on topic, which is the mound building era, pyramid building era, because you have some very interesting work in that subject with that subject matter. A lot of people are
Yeah.
going to go, "Whoa, Emmett, you're bugging, you're tripping, man." The pyramid building, in your opinion, of the major pyramids in Giza could have and should have been well into the Iron Age. What's your take on that in terms of the time? Because people are going to go, "No, Emmett, you can't be right." But go ahead, Emmett. I'll let you speak on it yourself, if you will.
Yeah, well, the pyramids of Giza, the pyramids that we think of usually when the word pyramid is mentioned, or the Giza pyramids, obviously, they were not used as altars of sacrifice, unlike the Mexican pyramids or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia,
Mm-hmm.
or arguably the pyramids of China. Um, but they were nonetheless they were cult. There were monuments. They weren't specifically built as tombs. I don't think anybody has ever been found in an Egyptian pyramid. They were cult objects, constructed ultimately as part of this solar cult, this stellar cult, and the Giza pyramids specifically were related to the myth of the phoenix. The legend of the phoenix stated that every 1,000 years or every 15, there were different versions of it. Every 1,000 or 1,500 years or 2,000 years, this mythical bird would fly to Heliopolis in Egypt. Now, Heliopolis was right next to the Giza plateau, and it would build a nest there, and it would sit in the nest and would be consumed by fire. And out of the ashes of this phoenix would arise a new phoenix, and it would fly off for another 1,000 years or so. Now it's recognized that the phoenix legend is a solar legend. It's got something to do with this idea of the periodic death and rebirth of the sun. Now, why would we imagine? Why would anybody have such an idea? Interestingly, the Aztecs had a similar idea, and that was one of the reasons for their human sacrifices. But the pyramids of Giza were certainly built in honor of this solar cult. Originally, the capstone, or the top of the pyramid, was encased in gold leaf. Now, the Egyptian word for the capstone was the benben, and the Egyptian word for the phoenix bird was the Bennu bird. So the benben and the Bennu bird were ultimately very, very closely related. So if you imagine the original appearance of the Giza pyramids, they were encased in smooth limestone, and the tops, the capstones, were covered in thin gold leaf. So that when the sun rose, the first rays of the sun would arise in the morning, the light would hit the top of the pyramid and shine out like some kind of a gigantic lighthouse, signaling the rebirth of the sun in the morning. Okay. So the Egyptians believed that the sun god died when it entered the west at night, it entered the land of Osiris. And every night the sun was in danger of being devoured by this cosmic serpent, a poppy, which lived in the underworld. Okay. So the Egyptian priests at night would perform these rituals to ensure that the sun, as it sailed in the river of the dead, the sun was imagined to sail in some kind of a huge ship
Mm-hmm.
under the earth, and it would then arise again. It would be reborn in the morning, so it was basically a rebirth. Okay, so the Giza pyramids were certainly constructed to mark some kind of a event wherein the sun appeared to die and then was reborn. Um, Now we have a similar biblical, a very very similar biblical account in the story of the Exodus, where one of the 10 plagues is the darkness over the land of Egypt. Okay, and of course this darkness doesn't last forever, but it lasts long enough to inflict a terrible crisis upon Egypt and great fear.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now the pyramid texts, which are not in the Giza pyramids, but inscribed in several of the Egyptian pyramids from the 5th and the 6th dynasty, we find reference to events very, very similar to those described in the book of Exodus, okay?
Okay.
And in another Egyptian document, we have the Ipuwer Papyrus, which
Mm-hmm.
is basically an Egyptian account of a cosmic catastrophe, very, very similar to that described in the book of Exodus. You know, Ipuwer laments the Nile. He says, why? Really, the Nile, the river has turned to blood, and there's darkness throughout the land, and people die, and cattle die, and basically all of the plagues, or almost all of the plagues recounted in the book of Exodus, are mentioned in the Ipuwer Papyrus. However, there's a big problem there because the papyrus is dated to, you know, the first intermediate period, which is
Mm-hmm.
placed around between 2000 and 2200 BC. So it's placed around 7 centuries before the date, the accepted date for the Exodus, if the Exodus occurred.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that these texts and the pyramids and this papyrus could possibly be referring to any event like the pyramid, it was discounted even before, or like the Exodus, it was discounted even before it was considered because of the chronology. So I'm mentioning this because the problem that the false chronology has created is that one by one, um, the accounts of ancient tradition and ancient authors, the um, the description of the ancient civilizations have had to be questioned and have ultimately thrown out because the chronology has distorted ancient history so much
Mm-hmm.
that archaeologists have not been able to find evidence of these events in the place that they expected. Okay, so they were expecting to find some evidence of the Exodus around the time of Ramesses II or Akhenaten, perhaps the heretic
Mm-hmm.
king, but they found no evidence there. Um, but these earlier documents of Egypt refer to very, very similar events, but they weren't considered as possibly referring to the Exodus because of chronology. Now, if it just if the problems just referred to or involved biblical history and Egyptian history, that would be bad enough. But unfortunately, the same problems extend into the whole of ancient history, the history of Greece, the history of Babylonia, the history of Persia. Okay, so one example, one of the worst examples, is that all of the Greek historians were very specific that before the rise of the Persian Empire, um, the Near East was controlled by a people called the Medes. Now, the Medes were closely related to the Persians. They spoke the Persian language. And in fact, the Persian takeover of the Mede Empire by Cyrus the Great is regarded more like a coup d'etat um, than an actual change of. It's more like a dynastic change than an actual change of empires. Um, Now, the Medes were reputed to have conquered the Assyrians. Um, and so archaeologists in the 19th and early 20th century expected to find above the Assyrian layers in Mesopotamia evidence of these Mede great kings, the kings of the Medes. Um, so there was, their names are quite difficult to, but I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
pronounce them
Right.
my own way. I don't know exactly how they should be pronounced. Cyaxares and Arbaces and Astyages, okay? These were some of the kings mentioned by the Mede kings mentioned by the Greek authors. But astonishingly enough, the archaeologists could find no evidence of any Mede kings or any Mede civilization in the areas in the strata in the ground where they were searching. However, 700 years before the Medes, contemporary with the great 18th dynasty of Egypt, there was a great empire that controlled that area, and it was called the Mitanni, the people of the god Mita. Now, the Mitanni kings had old Persian names, and they worshipped old Persian gods like Mitra, Indra, and Varuna. But of course, the Mitanni people were never associated with the Medes, because it was already decreed, even before they were discovered, it was already decreed that the stratum in which they were located dated to around 1500 BC, whereas the Medes were expected around 700 BC. Okay, so now the Mede Empire has been written out of the historical record. And that's only one example of one civilization after another, which the archaeologists have found no evidence of. Whereas on the contrary, when they started to dig into the soil of Mesopotamia, they found civilizations and cultures and kings that the Greeks had never heard of. They didn't find the people they were looking for, the Chaldeans and the Medes, but they found, lo and behold, an early civilization of Sumerians. And then they found, conquered by the Sumerians, were these people called the Akkadians, or the people of Akkad. The greatest king of Akkad was called Sargon, and his grandson was called Naram-Sin. And then this previously unknown Akkadian empire was overthrown or disappeared for centuries. And then the Mitanni people appeared in the same regions as the Akkadian kings. Okay, 700 years later, the Mitanni took over. And yet, lo and behold, the Mitanni claimed that they had conquered the Assyrian Empire. And the kings they named were called Sargon and Naram-Sin. Now, underneath the Mitanni layers, they couldn't find the old Assyrians, but they found the Akkadians. But the Akkadians were dated 700 years before the Mitannians. So the archaeologist says, well, the Akkadians can't be the same as the old Assyrians. And so this hiatus, this gap, which in fact shouldn't exist, was placed between the Mitanni people and the Akkadian Empire. So there was the Sumerians that the archaeologists had never heard of before. There was the Akkadians, there was the Mitanni, and then there was these Middle Assyrians and various other groups, Hittites, that nobody had ever heard of.
Right.
No Greek historian had heard of these people. So all these civilizations and cultures began to be discovered. But all the civilizations that the Greeks talked about, the Chaldeans, the Medes, they were nowhere to be found. Yeah, and this was one of the results of this fictitious chronology upon which. So the chronology is like a scaffolding upon which history is constructed. Now, if the scaffolding is distorted, then the overall picture, the overall structure is going to be distorted, and that's exactly what has happened. And it was to Gunnar Heinsohn's great credit that he cut through this a bit like Alexander cutting through the Gordian knot with his sword. This is a veritable Gordian knot of confusion that this false chronology has created, and it has caused immense problems for our understanding of ancient history. And the truth is that ancient history, and this is the very sad thing, ancient history is incredibly dramatic and incredibly exciting. And yet they have succeeded by this false chronology in making history look pedestrian, mundane, boring even. Okay.
Mhm.
It's all about little layers and potsherds and you
Oh yeah.
know little bricks here and there, and the true drama of ancient history has been lost, and the picture has been spoiled. It's like a jigsaw which has been put together in the wrong way, so the
Right.
picture makes no sense whatsoever. Um, so the reduction of the Near Eastern civilizations, when you take away all these fake civilizations that archaeologists have discovered, um, and you realize that the Sumerians were the Chaldeans that the Greeks talked about, the Akkadians were the old Assyrians, the Mitanni were the Medes, and immediately after them come the Persians. Suddenly, we don't need all these gaps. We don't need all these occupational hiatuses of 7 or 8 centuries or 1,000 years, which archaeologists talk about. One people follows another directly, and the history which the Greeks talked about makes perfect sense.
Definitely. See, you mentioned a lot there. I mean,
Yeah,
and for because I'm going to share this video in some of my other private groups. 2130 is Abraham's fictitious birthday. I'm going to say it just that way.
yeah,
Okay. I'm going to put some links in the description too on our previous videos and links in this video to lead people to some papers so that
yeah,
they can read this stuff. So the conundrum is Abraham's birthday is 2130. Now, I think it was Loftus' table that Gunnar Heinsohn used. I thought they put Naram Sin around 1700, but when you research it, he's right around 2250 or so.
yeah.
And then Sargon, wait a minute, Naram Sin was the son, Sargon was the dad, correct?
Yeah,
Sargon,
Sargon was the grandfather of Naram
grandfather.
Sin.
Okay, so Sargon would be before Naram Sin.
Yeah,
Uh, I'm hearing a little slight echo. I'm going to even turn my mic down a little bit more because I'm awfully close to my computer.
yeah,
Nonetheless, that throws it off all into a tailspin. Again, it makes the Greeks look like they didn't know what they were talking about. They're
yeah,
discredited at universities.
yeah,
Um, I was offended whenever I read all this, and then I knew because in my research I went backwards, meaning I started with mainstream information.
yeah,
And I don't think I researched this till about started in about 2016, maybe
yeah,
BC. I mean, BCE AD was after that. So it's pretty recent, but I was offended at Jules Aupert coming up with the fictitious Sumerians, greatly offended.
yeah,
Um, the Egyptians having 3 intermediate periods because man, they just keep getting beat by everybody with
yeah,
inferior weapons, but somehow they always win. But when
yeah,
they win, they go into a hiatus period, they have a decline, but then they
yeah,
come back better than ever, over
yeah,
and over and over and over again. Poor
yeah,
Egyptians just they must be excellent fighters because they had inferior weapons.
yeah,
I was offended by that. Um, then we talk about the Mitanni being the Indo-Aryan horse breeders around 1400 BCE or so.
yeah,
That's crucial because those excavations were re-examined, and there is no hiatus
yeah.
there of 600 to 700 years.
Yes,
It,
that's
it,
correct.
it's it, it's damning to the mainstream. Now that's peer-reviewed stuff here. The
Yeah.
textbooks should have changed already. That the
Yes.
Mitanni are misidentified Medes should be
Yes.
a done deal.
Yeah.
I always mention
Absolutely.
that. I always
Absolutely.
mention
The
that.
evidence
And
is
I don't throw I don't,
overwhelming.
yeah, I don't
Yeah.
throw jabs. Well, I do throw jabs a little bit. Um, I would
So
like
if
to then again ask Manfred B. Attack the same question. If
yeah,
in the excavations of Avarice,
yeah,
that for the first several layers, well, it's A and B, are from 300 to we'll say 500 BCE. That's Hellenistic, right at the top.
yeah,
Then there's a hiatus in his mind because it's not in the ground. There's a hiatus in his mind that he kicks the timeline of the late Ramsey period back to about 900 or so BCE, then to the
yeah,
beginning of the Ramsey period, about 12 or 1300, whatever those dates are. There's a huge gap, but I know there are no gaps in the archaeology, meaning he didn't dig down and then
Yeah.
there's a huge gap of material. There's
No.
just nothing in the ground. Then boom, we hit the Ramsey period. I know that for
Yeah.
sure, because then
Yeah.
when we get to the Hyksos period,
Yeah.
he starts subdividing up the strata to where there's 20 years here, 30, 40, 50 years within the strata layers, which are only 1 meter deep.
Yeah.
That is, it's not dishonest. It's just
Yeah.
him matching what he's seeing in the ground
Yeah.
to the standard chronology, instead of
Yeah.
just letting the archaeology speak for itself. Or say, he could have said, hey man, there's a problem here because there's no hiatus between the Hellenists and the late Ramsey period.
Yeah.
This even brings up more problems for the Exodus story. I'll tell people all the time. Now, so
Yeah.
from the biblical narrative point of view, this is really major, because then Amos is the one at first that chases the Hyksos up out of Egypt in through Palestine. Okay, there's other controversies because there's settlements that were burned. So would the Hyksos have done that, or Amos? He wouldn't have done that. Why would you burn the settlements that essentially you do control? It seems like they controlled them for a period of time. They didn't build any new settlements at all.
Yeah.
But then the biblical narrative says, oh no, see, Moses left and everything, and then they went through the Red Sea and boom, it swallowed up the Egyptians. Whoa, they just stopped pursuing these people then? They just said, oh, we're going to give up. Well, no, not according. Why would you give up if you're running somebody out, or somebody's leaving, in this case, and from the biblical narrative, somebody's leaving Egypt, they're going to chase them, but the Red Sea swallows us up, and you're not even going to mention that in your records at all. Oh my goodness, we were chasing them and the Red Sea opened up and it swallowed up our people, man. It just becomes so convoluted, because then after you get out of Egypt, eventually you're going to take the land of Canaan. Again, the Egyptians, we know, went up through that region, and historically you're going to say, well, Egyptians waged war on that region at a point. Either way, by the time the reign of David comes around, we're at around 1,000-ish or so BCE. David and Saul, David, Jesse, the whole group, they're around 1,000. If Solomon was the man, like they say he was the man, we should find an abundance of archaeology. We don't. Okay, it's plain and simple. We
Well,
just don't.
now this
But
is where I disagree with
yeah, because
Gunnar.
if you place them in the right period, so if you place Israel in the biblical dates, Israel doesn't
Yeah.
exist. If you place Israel where it should be, chronologically, stratigraphically, it does exist. That's, I tell people all the time.
Yeah.
It's the mystery is solved pretty easy. But again, I'm just talking about convoluted stories, and things just
Yeah.
don't add up. They don't
Yeah.
add up. I'll
Yeah.
pass the mic back. They don't add up. Go
Yeah.
ahead, and
Yeah.
you can continue. I mean, I didn't want to go on a rant, but it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I think the the best way to illustrate Gunnar Heinsohn's proposal for a start to the high civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Middle East around 1300 BC is to look at the stratigraphy, what we actually find in the ground in Babylonia and Mesopotamia, right? So at the bottom, the earliest literate culture is Sumerian, early Sumerian, okay? Um, these are conquered or basically overwhelmed by the Akkadian Empire of Sargon. Sargon is the king of the battle, he was called in a great epic poem. So he conquers the entire Near East, supposedly around 2300 BC. And then for 700 years, his grandson Naram-Sin, but shortly after that, the Akkadian Empire comes to an end. And supposedly for 700 years, nothing happens. And then these Mitanni, Mita people come in, these old Persian speaking people, and they take over, and they're contemporaries of the 18th dynasty. Now, the point Gunnar Heinsohn made is that um, there is no justification for placing 700 years between the Akkadians and the Mitanni, whose material remains sit directly above. There's complete continuity, and several German archaeological teams could prove that beyond any question of a doubt in 1989 and 1990 that this thing should already be in the textbooks, that there is no evidence of any gap whatsoever, that the Mitanni took over directly from the Akkadians, which means that the Akkadian kings Sargon and Naram-Sin are in fact the same as the old Assyrian kings Sargon and Naram-Sin, whom the Mitanni boasted of conquering. Okay, so you bring the Mitanni. If the Mitanni or the Mita people are the Medes of the 7th century, it means the Akkadians come right before them in the 8th century, and it means the early Sumerians come right before them, who are the Chaldeans, in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries. And there is no literate civilization before the 11th or 12th century or something like that, okay? And there is no archaeological justification for claiming that any literate civilizations before that time exist. As I say, this has been demonstrated now by professional archaeologists that these gaps, these alleged vast stretches of time, should not be there. They shouldn't be in the textbooks, okay? So the actual stratigraphic sequence in Mesopotamia is precisely how the ancient Greek authors described it. And this means a complete revolution in our understanding of ancient history. Affects Egypt just as much as it affects Mesopotamia. Contemporary with the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, we know that in Egypt at the time of the 5th and the 6th dynasty, pyramid building dynasties. Okay, so these dynasties must be brought down to the 8th century or 9th century, the same as the Akkadians. So the pyramid builders are around the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, no earlier than that. Okay, so it means a massive reduction in the chronology of ancient Egypt. The Pyramid of Cheops, for example, or Khufu, is currently dated to 2550 BC. So we have to reduce that by 15 or 1600 years, or maybe more. So we're talking about a massive reduction in history. That will make a lot of people very uncomfortable, and it makes professional archaeologists like Manfred Bietak very uncomfortable. They're even almost incapable of thinking about such things because it's so way beyond their experience and anything they learned at university. And of course, the first thing they say is this is conspiracy theorist crackpottery and lunacy, etc. Okay, rather than looking at the evidence. And as I say, the point is, especially with Manfred Bietak, he is a professional archaeologist. He knows that professional archaeologists have looked at this gap, the 7th century gap that supposedly exists in Mesopotamia between the material of the Akkadians and above them the material of the Mitanni, and they have demonstrated there's cultural and temporal continuity. There is no gap. There is no hiatus. There's no abandonment of the site for 700 years, So this is a major issue, and it will mean that every history book is going to have to be rewritten in a completely fundamental way. So far, as I say, the mainstream archaeological community have refused to accept it, and they're burying their heads in the sand. But eventually, the truth will out, because in the end, they're fighting against logic and reason, and ultimately against science. You can't ignore the evidence forever. You can bury your head in the sand for a long time, but ultimately you got to come up to breathe, I suppose. And they're going to have to come up and breathe eventually.
Right. We talk about this a lot. I mean, so then, even if we consider the story of the northern and southern kingdom in Israel, the kingdom of Israel and Judah, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Neo-Assyrians. Was that 700s or so BC?
Allegedly, yeah.
And then the southern kingdom was conquered by the Neo-Babylonians.
Yeah.
We have more confusing identifications of people. And we had talked about this about a week or so ago. So then from that point of view, the Neo-Assyrians and Neo-Babylonians, who we specifically talking about? Because Babylon comes up a lot. We see
Right.
I have some books in
These are
my
the
library.
Persian kings. This is one
Right.
of the another of the great problems caused by this fictitious chronology. Mesopotamia or Babylon became the capital of the Persian Empire. The Greek authors were all very, very clear about that Mesopotamia and Babylonia were major provinces of the Persian Empire. It was the center, it was a breadbasket of the Persian Empire. And Herodotus, the Greek historian, said that Babylonia, or Assyria as he called it, contributed more to the Persian treasury than all the other provinces. Okay, I don't know if he said all of them put together, but it was by far the richest satrapy of the Persian Empire.
Mhm.
Now, again, for 150 years, archaeologists have vainly sought, vainly searched for Persian age architecture remains material in Mesopotamia and the whole of Iraq. From top to bottom, they have searched and they have found virtually nothing, not a brick, not an inscription. The one exception
Mhm.
is in the city of Susa. Susa was right at the south of Mesopotamia. It was on the border of Persia proper. And there they did find recognizably Persian remains. Outside of Susa, in Babylon, in Nineveh, in Ashur, and the great cities of Iraq, um, nothing. They found hardly a brick, hardly an inscription, absolutely nothing. And it's the same in Syria and Palestine. Not an inscription of the Persian age, nothing, right? So again, this is a major issue. Where did
Right.
the Persians go in Mesopotamia? Where did they leave their impact in Syria and Palestine? We can't find them, but they're there. The difference is in Mesopotamia and Syria, Palestine, the Persian emperors used Assyrian names.
Mhm.
Their Babylonian subjects spoke a Semitic language. The names of the Persian kings would have been unpronounceable to them. You know, we have we call him Xerxes, but it was Sharsha and
Mhm.
Artasharsha. These names, these Persian names, would have been virtually unpronounceable to the people of Mesopotamia and
Mhm.
Syria, Palestine, who spoke Semitic languages. And furthermore, they were religiously non significant. So the kings of ancient times were representatives of the gods. So the kings of Persia, as king of Mesopotamia, as king of Assyria, as king of Babylon, they took on local names honoring the local deities, okay? In honor of
Mhm.
Ashur, in honor of Nebo, etc. Okay? And the Persian kings are, they left a huge number of monuments in Mesopotamia and Syria, Palestine, but there they are under the name of Neo Assyrian and Neo Babylonian kings like um, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, um, Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonassar, etc. These are actually Persian kings using Semitic names. They are not actually Neo-Assyrian or Neo-Babylonian kings. And this is another issue. It's a major issue that will have to be sorted. Because, as I say, otherwise we have to accept that not only was there no Mede Empire, then we have to accept that there was no Persian Empire in Mesopotamia or Syria, Palestine, which is absurd. We know that
Mhm.
there was.
Right. 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 It's a conundrum. With the mainstream chronology, I'll call it, these arguments are going to go on forever.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I don't think people are ever going to be able to problem solve, reconstructing, if you will, the ancient past. It's not going to work. But as you said, yes, when you shorten the chronology, as the stratigraphy shows, there's drama. There's a
yeah,
lot of drama in the first millennium BCE because now what has been stretched out to the Akkadians, the old Akkadians, I think, and the Egyptians. Uh, from that time frame, you're squeezing it down. Like I said, I've told
yeah,
people this. You're squeezing it down. In
yeah,
it, there's drama. Like there's
yeah,
drama in the world right now.
yeah,
Since the 1700s, we're only
yeah,
talking, you know, several hundred years.
Yeah.
There's been
It
nothing
all
but
makes
drama
perfect
in the world.
sense.
The Revolutionary War, the Civil War,
Yeah.
the Spanish wars. Come on, it doesn't stop. There
Yeah.
aren't these big gaps. It just keeps going. There's drama. There's drama in the
Yeah.
world then. There's
Yeah.
drama in the world now.
Yeah.
Um,
When the
but
chronology is put right, the whole thing makes perfect sense.
yeah,
And, there are no, the conundrums and mysteries. And of course, this also involves, we talk about it some other time, some of the most dramatic and romantic episodes of ancient history. This impacts, for example, our understanding of the Trojan War and
mm,
the Greek mythological, semi mythological age, the
right,
heroic or the Mycenaean age.
right,
Again, the consequences are dramatic. It means that the gold, the gold filled tombs that Heinrich Schliemann found at Mycenae in Greece, which he believed to be the burial places of King Agamemnon, who led the Greek expedition against Troy. Uh, it means that, in fact, it was highly likely that the people, the buried the buried kings, the buried princes that he found there were indeed either Agamemnon and his entourage or part of Agamemnon's dynasty. But that's another issue. As I say, when the framework, when the scaffolding is put right, suddenly the picture makes perfect sense, and it's a dramatic picture. So
right.
as I say, we can talk about that. We can talk about the implication for Greek history in some future episode, but it
Oh
is
yeah.
incredibly dramatic. And Schliemann, when he lifted the gold face mask off the man, the most magnificent burial in the burial pits, um, the face, no oxygen had got to the face in several thousand years anyway, and it was completely undecayed. And he says he could even see the bristles, the bristles of the guy's face. He needed a shave. And
Hmm.
he says as soon as the oxygen began to do its work, he says the face began to disintegrate in front of his eyes. So
Wow.
but anyway, he telegraphed the king of Greece. He says, "I have looked on the face of King Agamemnon." Now
Hmm.
we can rehabilitate again. It's poo-hooed. It's said that Schliemann was wrong, and these burials were from 400 or 500 years before Agamemnon. We can rehabilitate Schliemann, and we can rehabilitate the Greek historian Pausanias, who said that that was where the tombs would be found. Um, I can assure you, those were the burials, if not of Agamemnon. If that wasn't Agamemnon himself, it was certainly one of his dynasty. Okay, and this is possibly some of the most dramatic consequences of the
Right,
realignment of ancient history, which
right,
needs to be done.
right. I'm gonna make another statement because I'm gonna correct myself. I was talking about the Saturnian reconstructions and Jovian reconstructions of the ancient solar system. I said fatal mistake of not knowing the chronology is incorrect. I would call it a crucial error
Yeah,
because then, in methodology wise, and to Dave Talbot's credit, he wrote the Saturn myth, or it was published at least in 1980. Heinsohn didn't even really start his breakthrough till about 88 or so.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
he wouldn't
So
have known anything about it. A
yeah,
Now we have it now. We have to consider and integrate everything within, I'll call, the Thunderbolts movement, because
yeah,
it led me to Heinsohn.
yeah,
That movement led me to the directions I went in. It
yeah,
absolutely did. So in his methodology, he talks about using the oldest text for the reconstruction first, the oldest
yeah,
archetypes. You have to look at it as a composite, I say now. It's a composite.
yeah,
Pyramid
yeah,
text not being 3200 BCE or so, and then
yeah,
the Greeks being 600 or so BC.
yeah,
Close the gap and look at it as a composite.
yeah.
It may make different sense,
Absolutely,
than
absolutely.
it does in its current form. Um,
Yeah,
'Cause I'm not throwing any shade at those guys. I have a lot of respect for those guys. Obviously, if
yeah,
you look at my library, it will reflect, the Velikovskyan paradigm,
yeah.
really, pretty much so. So I just want to correct myself. I said fatal mistake. I said there's a crucial error in methodology, in my
Hmm.
opinion. Um, and we're also looking for any mainstream academians, biblical
Yeah.
scholars, I'm going to use my slang. If you want the smoke, we have the smoke. And this could be a very a great conversation between myself, you, and anybody else that wants to talk about it, because we have class within the History Valley family, I call it. We have class. There are a lot of
Mhm.
other YouTubers out there where things get out of control quickly. People start getting emotional. There are arguments. That even happens in mainstream academia. I've seen Finkelstein make some comments and stuff, man. I'm like, wow,
Yeah.
those guys get really upset about this stuff. I don't. I'm a I call myself an amateur historian, and I'm a journalist at this point. I'm doing this for journalistic purposes and my own personal reasons. Um, Either way, I do want to still stress that, and I'll make sure I put the links in the section when I upload the video. Emmet's books, because I have the Genesis of Israel and Egypt. You sent me the Ages in Alignment. I have probably the older one. I have a rough draft of the newer book. Now, is the Ages in Alignment? It is available on Amazon now.
Yeah, that's the series. So I think it may have been, I can't remember. Was it in the time? No, Egypt's Ramesside pharaohs and the Persians. Was that it?
See, yeah, there's a bunch, and I'm like, the
Yeah,
Ages in Alignment. You sent me some stuff, and then the publishers never sent me anything.
yeah,
But I'm
yeah.
gonna put the descriptions and links up so people can do some research. I'll also put up some links. Big shout out to Anna Marie DeGrazia. You know, she's archived a lot.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
was trying to get in touch with her too. I sent her an email. If you watch this video, Anna Marie, just check your email. Um, but we're going to put some links in the description so people can definitely look this stuff up so we don't send you on a chase. It took me time to gather this information. And when I started finding the resources, besides the books I ordered, it makes life a lot easier, but there's a lot of reading involved. Gunnar Heinsohn uses charts and pictures too in his research. So you're just not reading a lot. He mentioned that at some point in one of his papers. But there's a lot to read. It can take you years, and I'm being honest. If you really want to wrap your head around it, if you're reading it, it could take you some time to really grasp it. It's like a master's degree course, basically. And I'm being honest. But once you get it, you'll see it. You can't unsee it. I can't unsee this anymore. So, you know, it's not to throw shade again, like I use slang at any mainstream academians. um, I've said for a while, when I'm pursuing the information, so to speak, my beef is with mainstream academia and education system in the United States. That's what I see as a problem. Um, we lost Emmett, but I'm going to end the show anyway soon. But that's where I see the problem being, is within American academia. Emmett is not from the United States. Uh, Gunnar Heinsohn is not from the United States. Emmanuel Velikovsky is not from the United States. And I can keep naming them on and on and on. Some in the group, the Thunderbolts Project group, are from the United States. But the people that I'm interested in their research, they're not from the United States. They are in Europe, mainly. So who better to go to for information about European and history of the West, but people that live there, people that have walked and seen these places like ancient Rome. I've never been to Rome. Um, I've never seen the ruins of Rome and what they look like today. I've only have to rely on the scholarship that I can acquire from social media or the internet, we call it, and from Professor Heinsohn, who, again, we had 2 videos that were uploaded to History Valley that are now on Var Valley. Uh, Once again, I'd like to thank Emmet for coming on the show. We are going to pick this back up. I will have the links in the description for where, you know, for where people can actually read and research this information. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.